he gave me a book on art forgery. I found myself drawn to these old masters. How did these artists take paint from a palette, arrange it on a canvas? I began to unlock the secrets. I was a storehouse of knowledge of how to create an illusion, present it to an experienced expert, manipulate his mind, and convince him and bring him to the inevitable conclusion that the painting is genuine. We flooded the market with my paintings, and I couldn't believe what I did. I couldn't believe it. Then the dominoes started falling, and eventually the FBI were led to my door. They uncovered a mountain of evidence against me.
But they never actually got you. At this point, you've sold a lot. You've got like $1 million in cash. You sold one painting for $717,000. Why did it go away? Why did you never get indicted? And how are we having this conversation?
I guess that's the greatest story of all.
To hear how Ken Perenni made millions in art forgery, dodged the mafia and the FBI, subscribe to The Jordan Harbinger Show and check out episode 282 in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we continue our look at the murder of Robert Wone. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my imaginative co-host, Alice.
Hi, Brett. Thank you. Today is going to be a day of imagination in a way that I don't like, actually, because this case, more than probably any other case we've ever covered, both in real life and on the podcast, and now at this point, we're talking thousands of cases that you and I have come across in our careers, both in the podcast world and lawyer worlds. I've never come across a case that boggled my mind so much. And in a lot of ways, you have to use your imagination because there is something that is just inexplicable, but everything in this world is explainable. I just don't know the answers. And so I'm really glad we're diving into today because I want to know more answers. I think a lot of our listeners want to know more answers, but more importantly, for Robert and his loved ones, his friends, his family, everyone who has been touched by this case, whether on the legal side or have just heard of it or have worked with him in some legal capacity, want to know what happened. And I think the only way to kind of get there is to use our imaginations in ways that we've never done before.
Yeah, and look, there's a tension in true crime. There are people, I think we've scared them all off by now, who don't like when podcasters speculate at all. They just want to hear the facts. That's all they want to hear. I think that is so boring. I can't even imagine listening to a podcast that just did that. But there are people who complain all the time that we're always speculating. And it's not speculation when what you're doing is taking the evidence and the facts you have, applying your common sense and your reasoning, and attempting to develop a theory that fits those facts. You may be wrong, but I think it's a good way to try and make sense of the world.
And here's the thing, in the course of our jobs and also in kind of researching for our podcast episodes, this and others, we talk to a lot of people on and off the record who are involved in these cases. In like our real cases, we talk to our agents all the time. And one thing that everyone talks about, even when there's not evidence necessary that's admissible to back it up, or they're not on the stand and they would never say this publicly, every single person has theories if they've worked on these cases even if they can't prove it in court. And when we speak to people off the record, you bet your bottom dollar that is a massive topic of conversation is, what do you think happened? You guys all ask us that when you see us in person. You're like, okay, you covered that case, but like, what do you really think happened? And you know why? It's because we ultimately go through the records and we go through all of this analysis for one purpose, to seek and understand. And so when you leave out that last part, which is to take a stab, and it is a leap of faith to be able to do that, not of wild speculation, but rooted in the facts that you do know, recognizing it's a puzzle with many missing pieces. This particular case, I think, has more missing pieces than any other case that I've really seen, yet have so many pieces that seem like they should tell the story, but they don't. If we leave out that last part, which is our theories, and not just like, oh, knife went into body, dead, but what led to those events that night, I think you are missing the entire exercise of why we revisit these cases. So with that, that's me preaching as to why I think it's important to give theories. And they don't have to be your theories. You can vigorously disagree with it, and I hope you do, and we always welcome that. But that is why we read all of the record, and that's why we dive into the analysis, because ultimately we're seeking to understand what happened at the end.
So Alice mentioned taking a stab at it, and with that very poor pun, let's talk about the stab wounds in this case. So we've talked about them a little bit, but I want to talk about them some more. So the stab wounds were 4 to 5 inches deep and 7/8 inches long on the skin surface. It's been said that the knife that was taken from the knife block, it's not as if it could not have made these wounds, but it's not the most natural knife that you would think would make these wounds. The prosecution actually brought in a knife expert, and he would testify that the knife from the set that was found under Dylan's bed that was missing one knife, the missing knife, he said, would more naturally fit with these wounds. Now, his mother would say, I sent him those knives, I kept that one back, not sure what happened to it, but that's what it was. It wasn't a murder weapon. Put that aside, you can decide whether you believe her or not. As we've said, I think there's reason to believe the kitchen knife could have made this wound. We'll leave that for theories. We'll talk about that some more. But there's something else that I want to talk about when we talk about the stab wounds. And I brought myself tonight a plastic knife that I'm going to use to demonstrate this, at least for the people who are watching at home. And we'll talk about it for those of you listening on the podcast. So these stab wounds, you know, we talked about how they're clean stab wounds. There's no tearing. They're in and out, as if Robert didn't even move. He didn't struggle, nothing. But it's not just that. If you read the autopsy and if you read the judge's report, they're also all oriented identically. And what's interesting about them, that is interesting in of itself, that they're all oriented identically. But it's not just that. The sharp edge of the knife, so the cutting side of the knife, is pointed towards the right shoulder. And the blunt edge is pointed diagonally toward Robert's left side. The stabs are oriented front to back and slightly downward. And as we said, it appears that neither Robert nor the attacker moved during the attack. They were perfect incisions. But I want you to think about the way the knife was oriented. So in a diagonal, with the blade pointing towards the right shoulder and the blunt edge pointing towards the left side. Now, this room was set up so that if you came in through the door, the bed is perpendicular to you. Robert would have been laying, just imagine that he was stabbed where he was laying. He would have been laying on the bed. The person walks in. Now, I want you to think about if somebody was laying down and you came to their left side and you were going to stab them, how would you hold the knife? There's a couple ways that sort of make sense. I think the way that makes the most sense is like in Psycho. So you've all seen Psycho. You're holding the knife. You've got the blade straight down. You can go up and down. Well, the problem is if you walked in on someone like Robert and you had the knife like that and you stabbed Robert. So he's laying down. You come in. You're going to stab Robert. The blade edge would not be pointing towards his right shoulder. It would be pointing towards his left side. The blunt edge of the blade would be pointing to his right shoulder if you were going to do that. The other way I guess you could do it is you're holding the blade straight. But once again, even if you did that, if you attacked him from the natural side, which is as you're walking in and seeing him, the blade is not going to be pointed in the direction where it's pointed. In order for it to be pointing that way, you would actually have to walk around the bed and stab him from the other side if you did it in any way that was normal. And then if you stabbed him from that side, when you stab downward, you're on that side of him. You've walked around the bed and you're going to stab him in sort of the typical psycho way. If you did it that way, then you would have the right side of the blade pointing at his shoulder and the blunt side pointing towards the left side of his body. So the reason I bring this up, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for this person to come in to stab. Remember, they already got to go up the steps. They're already bypassing Dylan Ward's room. Now you're saying that they would walk around into Robert's room. They would come up to Robert. And rather than just stabbing him there, they would then walk around to the other side and stab him from that side. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and it makes me wonder whether he was stabbed in the bed or if he was stabbed at some other location and then placed in the bed.
Yeah, and certainly when you're evaluating the stab wounds with respect to an intruder, the walking around the bed, especially when you walk around the bed, at the foot of the bed were all his valuables, right? His BlackBerry and his 2 wallets were all on that side because there was like a little table there. They were undisturbed. They were not taken, and they had to walk all the way around, which is very risky if you're an intruder because you want an easy access out, right? That's why we said Dylan Ward's room was kind of the prime intruder room, because you could walk in that room, which is directly at the top of the stairs, stab someone in there, turn around, and your exit is unimpeded because the stair is right in front of you. So now not only would your exit be down the hall, past another person's room, down the stairs, you now have the added obstacle of a pull-out bed, right? So potentially you could jump over it, but why the added levels of difficulty if your whole point of intruding was not to rob this beautifully decorated house of any of the electronics and items that are of value, but to kill this one person? That's the only thing that can come to mind. You've bypassed every other person you can kill. You're going for the one person who doesn't live there, but you're not just going to do your assassination and run out. You're going to make this assassination a high level of difficulty. By walking around, what happens if Robert wakes up? He's going to be between you and the door if you're the intruder. So this says, I think, a lot about the intruder theory. It says a lot about the potential direction of where the intruder is in terms of positioning, right? We've been talking about stabbing where you are essentially at the middle of Robert's body, because when you walk in, it's like his body's laying there. So if you're assuming that these stab wounds are from the middle of the body, it's still hard to achieve those angles. So a little bit weird, though, if you're stabbing someone from, say, the head, past their head, especially if the head is right up against the wall, which is what the pull-out bed was against. There was no space really between the pull-out couch and the wall. So just imagine getting enough leverage where the wall is on one side of you, and it's a strange, just default position to be in. Like you really want to make sure you see the top of his nose while you're stabbing him. I'm not sure why you would choose that angle in order to achieve the angles that we see in his autopsy.
And when you read the autopsy report, the way it's described in the autopsy report is that the knife blade, so they use a clock. So imagine there's like a clock on Robert's chest. So the blunt side of the knife is at the 4 o'clock. The sharp side of the knife is at the 10 o'clock. So just take a moment and do this to yourself. Take something, take a plastic knife, take a spoon, I don't care what it is, but just position it in your chest where the blunt side is at 4 o'clock, the sharp side is at 10 o'clock, and imagine how the person would have to be holding that knife for it to enter at that angle. And imagine yourself laying flat on a bed and someone is going to stab you that way with the knife going in like that, where the sharp end is at 10 o'clock, the blunt end is at 4 o'clock. And I think you'll see what I'm saying. It just, when you imagine the way the hand would be holding it, it's coming at you from your right side. And the door is on Robert's left side. So if someone came in, they either held the knife in a really strange way. I mean,
like stabbing toward, if you think the stabbing happened from the left side, you'd have to be thinking that person is stabbing towards their own stomach, right? Like in your direction, whereas like the most leverage is typically straight down or at an angle that gives you leverage that is angling away from your body. Think about how you cut vegetables, right? You don't cut towards yourself because you don't have the leverage in order to enter that knife. Same thing with stabbing a body. That's why this is so strange. Could it happen? Sure. And another thing to note about that, because of 3 precise wounds that are at the exact same angle, the knife didn't slip. So if you're thinking, well, he had it in one hand and then he didn't realize how hard it was to stab someone, so that when the knife made contact, it kind of slipped, and that's why you see the weird angle. It's not that he was stabbing him weirdly. He was doing it normally and then the knife slipped. Well, then the knife slipped perfectly 3 times. And the knife didn't slip 3 times into the same wound. It slipped all over his body because the 3 wounds are in his abdomen and his chest. 2 different areas in his chest. So if anything, this is very deliberate.
Right. And all 3 wounds are exactly the same. All 3 wounds with the blunt side at the 4 o'clock and the sharp side at the 10 o'clock. So, whoever did this, there's been speculation, for instance, there's 3 wounds, there's 3 people, maybe 3 different people did it. But the chances that 3 different people would have stabbed him in exactly the same orientation, I think, are pretty slim. I think whoever did this, however they stabbed him and wherever they were when they stabbed him, wherever he was when he got stabbed, it was the same person who did it. The fact that you have very similar depths, you have the exact same orientation, I think it's probably the same person stabbing him each time.
And then obviously we've talked about this. No tears, no signs of either attacker or Robert moving, which is huge because even electrodes in your body react to want to fight. Even if you're not completely conscious, your body is always wanting to self-preserve. There's no indication he even flinched, like his chest flinching, even if his hands didn't go up. Let's say he was restrained. There's no ligature marks, so we don't actually have evidence of him being restrained. But imagine maybe someone's holding his arms down so he can't come up to block his chest being stabbed. But you would think, even if he were not completely with it, his body would flinch out of pain, out of nerves being, cut through, and you would see some sort of, minute movement within the wounds. None of that. It's as if he were perfectly still, and as was the attacker. Now, this really is like the movie Psycho, because I imagine it is so monotone in the way the stabbing happened that it had to have happened that way to have 3 identical stab wounds. And I imagine, if you watch the movie Psycho, literally, the killer has a knife and it goes, ee, 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 because the person who's being stabbed is screaming and trying to get out of the way, and the attacker does nothing except the same movements over and over, and somehow that slashes her to death. But here, that had to have been what happened, not just with Robert, which is strange in and of itself, but the attacker. So no anger, no rage killing. Rage killing, you'll see, overkill, for example. You'll see movement. You'll see excitement, some sort of adrenaline. It's as if there was no adrenaline, and almost like an oil rig going down and up, down and up, down and up.
And I think that's supported by the notion that the blade didn't go all the way in. If it's the kitchen knife, as we've said, it's not this sort of rage type thing. It is a very methodical stabbing that doesn't even go all the way to the base of the knife.
Which, again, taking back to the intruder theory, that's almost scarier to me. Someone who has no adrenaline behind what they're doing whatsoever. Let's say they came in to kill Robert, and imagine this is the person, like, if you're going to come in and kill me, I hope you're like guns a-blazing and be like, die! No, you have to imagine this person had utter self-control and moved deliberately 3 times. So deliberately that there was absolutely no movement within the wounds. That means there's a deliberateness to the cut and also a lack of speed to the cut in order to have such clean wounds. This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. Yep, while you're listening to us talk, you're probably also driving, cleaning, exercising, or maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you can be doing right now. getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy, and you could save money by doing it right from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save nearly $750 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year, so you're protected no matter what.
Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.
Okay, so those are the stab wounds. Now that all of you are in some public place or going for a run and pretending to stab yourself in a weird angle, tell people it's because of the podcast that you listen to and you're not actually crazy.
Exactly.
I still do that in the car. And apparently, actually, my neighbor saw me walking one time and I was trying to figure out an angle of a stab. And she saw me like a week later and she's like, I saw you, but you seemed to be talking to someone, but no one was there. And I was like, yeah, okay. I know what I was doing. I was on a phone calls for work. Anyways, let's move on to something else that we've touched upon that all of you are probably wondering. And that is the relationship between Dylan Ward and Joe Price. What exactly was that relationship? What does it have to do with what happened here? So we know that Joe Price and Victor had been in a relationship much longer than Dylan entering the picture. They had been married, I believe that's correct. They had a bedroom on the 3rd floor, and their community certainly knew Victor and Joe to be a couple. Later on, though, after the two of them are an established couple, Dylan enters the picture. But the relationship is a little bit more nuanced, because some of you may have heard throuple. We heard that in the documentary. Oh, people are going to be biased against them because they're a throuple. And a throuple being a 3-way relationship. It's not exactly what appears to have happened as the investigation continued here. Now, it wasn't a secret that Dylan had some relationship status in this. People knew about it, but it wasn't as widely known to all of their friends, maybe not within their tight-knit community, as Victor and Joe's relationship. So we know that the relationship seemed to be between Dylan and Joe specifically. We also know that by this time, their relationship was actually on the way down. Things were degrading. And there was testimony at trial that Joe Price was eager to draw Dylan back into the relationship, even though the relationship was kind of getting tenuous. At trial, it was said, quote, on the other hand, Mr. Ward, in particular, was, according to the evidence, somewhat independent of the group and of Mr. Price's influence. He had indicated flagging interest in Mr. Price only weeks before the murder, and Mr. Price was making efforts to draw him back into his sphere.
And look, when you're thinking about this case and thinking about motive for this seems like an inexplicable crime. If this isn't a stranger murder, if it's not random, if it involves these men, then this is one of Joe's oldest and best friends. I think Joe was in his wedding or vice versa. And you've got this situation where Dylan Ward, who is the guy on the 2nd floor, he's in this sort of strange situation. And there's been discussion about this. If you watch the documentary, there was discussion about this, about their relationship and sort of the dominant submissive relationship. And Ward was the dominant one. And Joe Price was the submissive one, and you can run down all sorts of rabbit trails with that. But I think putting all that aside, the stuff that's sort of like sexy and like, draws you into the documentary, and maybe it's important, maybe it's not. I think it's just a basic relationship situation. You have Dylan Ward is sort of pulling away, and Joe is trying to encourage him to stay with it. And it makes you wonder what kind of thing could have happened involving one of Joe's oldest and best friends that is related to this. Now, maybe it's not related to it at all, but when you're starting to think about a motive and you think about the interpersonal dynamics at play, I think it's something you have to look at, and it's something that probably is important in one way or another.
Now, the night of the stabbing, the police foolishly kept all three men together in the living room. And the police noticed that the men were whispering together until the police began to question them. Joe Price, Robert's old friend, one of his best friends, did most of the talking when being questioned. At one point, Dylan did begin to speak to the police, but Joe gave him a withering stare and he stopped. Joe said that it was the door chime that had woken them, and he said he thought they'd left the back door unlocked. And in fact, the police did find an unlocked and slightly ajar back door. The door chime presumably was from the front door opening. So why the killer did not flee through the route they came in is unknown. But perhaps leaving through the front door was just faster.
And people have asked, was there a record of this door chime? Because we've done these kind of cases before, and sometimes there are, and you can find out exactly when doors opened and closed. In this case, no. The alarm system was not on. It wasn't recording openings. The door did chime, but there was no record of it. So there's no way to prove whether or not the door opened, the front door opened at the time you would expect for this to happen. As far as the back door, I would just say, as someone who's lived in D.C., as someone who lived in D.C. at this time, it would have been pretty rare to leave the door unlocked. These gentlemen, they had a security system. They took this seriously. D.C. can be a dangerous place. Your back door in particular, which opens up onto alleyways, is one you are going to keep locked. So not saying it couldn't have happened, but I think it was unbelievable to police that they would have left this door unlocked. And it's a little unbelievable to me as well. Like I said, not saying it couldn't happen, but it's not the most believable story. And when you combine it with everything else, you'd have to believe to think a intruder did this. It feels more like something someone did after the murder and not something that happened before.
And remember, the back door led into the living spaces, the kitchen, the living room, which when police arrived said that there were flat screen TVs, bolted to the wall. There was a laptop leaning against a couch, all valuables that are very close to a door. And certainly when I lived in D.C., the last thing I did every night was make sure all my doors were locked. And I had deadbolts on them because D.C. is just not a very safe place. And certainly if I had a bunch of electronics within view of a window, which these were, I certainly would be locking the door. Again, mistakes are made sometimes. People forget. But one thing to note, they didn't have a dog or anything that would warrant them, for example, to be letting the dog out late at night and they might forget to lock it once the dog went out. Nothing like that. Just these three men who lived there, and then Robert, who was visiting that night. And another person who has kind of become a character in this story and is a bit of a question mark, and that's Joe Price's brother, Michael Price. Now, Michael broke into his brother's apartment, Joe Price's, a couple months after the murder, and he stole some things from Price's house. Now, the three men did not report the robbery to the police for some time, though it's reported that Dylan wanted to report this to the police. But apparently Dylan was stopped by Joe from reporting it. I guess I could imagine Joe wanting to protect his brother, but that itself is kind of weird too. They were not estranged brothers. They had a relationship, certainly. Friends reported seeing them together. So this is not a situation where they hadn't spoken in decades or whatnot. So kind of feels strange that you would rob your brother's house, especially just a couple months after a very traumatic event happened there. The murder of your best friend in your own house. That he would break in and steal, I think he stole like a TV, but, things of value when he was having a talking relationship with his brother. And if he needed something, he could probably have asked his brother if he needed money, for example, or if he really liked his TV. Maybe his brother would have just given it to him. But they don't report it to the police. Again, that part is not that surprising to me because if my own sibling was having a hard time or something, I don't really want to get them in legal trouble, have them to go to jail. But they did eventually tell police. And this actually was kind of an interesting twist in everything because then they started looking more into Michael. And one thing to note about Michael is that he was studying phlebotomy at the time, and he had class the night of Robert's murder. Except Michael missed class that night. Now, Of course, some of you may be thinking, well, if you missed class, then that gives him the opportunity to be at Joe Price's house to have done something to Robert. So maybe it wasn't the three men. Maybe Michael, who's studying phlebotomy, had access to drugs that could potentially be lethal, came in that night. He's already broken into the house at least once. Maybe he broke into the house another time. Maybe he knew how to push the door ajar as it was found by police. So maybe their story is actually true, and Michael, having missed class and can't be accounted for there, is the one who is to blame. Now, Michael does have an alibi. His partner vouched for him and said he was at home. Now, we've talked about the credibility issues that may entail if you're testifying for the alibi of a loved one. But we will know that the court heard testimony about this, and the court found it highly unlikely that Michael was involved, despite potentially a lot of smoke around him.
Yeah, and another thing, it's true, it's hard to credit what a loved one says about you. We've talked about this before. You would think if Michael was one who broke in before and killed Robert, he's proved that unlike that mystery intruder, he actually knows how to steal things when he breaks into a house. So you think he would have stolen something. That's the first thing. It's not clear why he would kill Robert. His cell phone was also where he claimed he was, which is a little bit more powerful back then than it is now, just because we didn't really understand. It was not as widespread, the understanding of how easily you can track people with a cell phone at the time. So he probably wouldn't have thought to leave it behind. It doesn't seem like a premeditated murder. And the court pointed out, the court's position was basically these three guys, at least one of them would have known if Michael did it, because the court's position is pretty much one of these guys is involved. Maybe two of these guys are involved. Can't say which two. Two of them are. If Michael was the murderer, they would have known that. They would have reported it eventually, just like they eventually reported the robbery. So the court felt like Michael was a red herring. I don't know if he is or not. I think it's possible he has some involvement in this case, even if he wasn't there that night, and we'll talk about that more as we go on. So that's the evidence that we have here. I think it's time.
Just in case, it took me until my adult life to really understand what phlebotomy was. But phlebotomy, for those of you who may not know, a phlebotomist is someone who draws blood from a vein with a needle. So they work with needles. They are medically trained, but they're not a doctor. I don't think you have to be a nurse. I think you can just get a certification to be a phlebotomist. It may depend on jurisdiction. But one thing to note is it's someone who works with needles, either drawing blood or injecting medicine. So knowing, which veins to use and having access to medications that are intravenous.
Yeah. And when you have a case where it's suggested that someone was injected with something, the phlebotomist, in the bedroom with the hypodermic is a pretty good clue guess.
It's a great angle. It's a great angle. I would definitely want to choose that when we're playing Clue.
Right. Exactly. Okay, so that is generally speaking the evidence in this case. You can read the court's opinion. There are various websites where you can find different things. We're going to post a bunch of them on our website as well. You can read them for yourself. You can read the autopsy report and all that jazz. But I think we've reached a point where we can start talking about theories, and we can talk a little bit more about some of the evidence as we look at it through the lens of the possible things that happen in this case. And I think the place you have to start is the place that everyone started, and that this is an intruder. So that is the theory presented by the three men, is an intruder entered the home and killed Robert. Initially, this seems plausible. DC is a violent place. It's probably a little bit more violent than it was back then, but even back then, it wasn't safe. Sort of, DC is this very interesting city where the safe zones sort of expand and contract. And at this point, this part of town was a pretty safe area, but even in safe areas, you still could have things like this happen. And it's not unusual to have, people running up and down the alleys behind people's houses with machetes. Those calls get called in all the time. So it's not...
And specifically machetes, by the way.
Yes.
We
Machetes
had in our
popular.
back alley, DC has a lot of these alleys where all the fronts of the houses face out. That's how you have the beautiful row houses. But that means the back alley is like a very narrow road, and it leads to everyone's backyard if you have a garage. But it's the back of your houses, and they all face each other. So your backyard immediately faces your across the street neighbor's backyard. And there was a machete-wielding man in my back alley. like, you hear of that as the example, and it really happened to me. There was like a little like tweet that went out, was like, don't go outside, machete yielding man out there. So this is not an exaggeration. It's really what happens.
Intruders bring their own knives in DC. So
Big ones. Big ones.
Big ones. They wouldn't be stabbing you with some little kitchen knife. They're going at you with a machete. Okay. But putting aside that and putting aside the idea that DC is a dangerous place, why is it hard to believe that there's an intruder? So there's some pretty big facts that hurt this. Number one, the back patio, which you would have had to have gone through to get to the back door, it was surrounded by an 8-foot fence, had an equally high locked gate. The back door might have been open and unlocked. The gate was not. Now, it was possible to get over the fence, and the defense would show examples of leaping over the fence, but nothing on the fence, including the pollen on the fence, was disturbed. And if you guys, if you ever lived anywhere where you have a lot of pollen, there is a coating of pollen on all your stuff from basically the beginning of March until the end of June. So if someone had touched that fence at all, they would have left evidence of it. You couldn't leap over it without touching the top, and there was no evidence anyone did.
And in fact, it is currently pollen season, at least where we live, Brett. It's starting to get a little bit warm. The flowers are starting to bloom, and there is a layer of pollen all over my house right now. And those of you who've been around pollen, it's sticky. So at first I was like, okay, but maybe it was like the very sticky sap kind, where if you disturbed it, it wouldn't actually be disturbed, because like pollen sticks around for that long because it is sticky. So just for funsies, I went outside today and just like grabbed different parts of my house. Like it's on the staircase. I have brick stairs. I put my hand on it. I put my feet on it, or my shoes on it. I have a fence, and I, grabbed my fence kind of as if I was going to jump over it, and kind of just put my hand everywhere. My kids thought I was crazy because we were playing outside. And I was like, kids, do you want to come do an experiment with me? Put your hands all over the pollen. And it does. It does disturb it. And we have some pretty sticky pollen around here. I was just curious, how much is there a way that I could basically move it without disturbing it? And it was very difficult to not be able, with, looking at the place I had touched, not to notice some disturbance, or to see my handprint, my fingerprint, my shoe print on all of these different pollen areas. Because the other thing is, when it's pollen season, everything keeps getting repollinated. And so when it's slightly disturbed, more pollen continuously collects on surfaces, so that there are differences in kind of the pollen that's added up over time versus pollen that's maybe been rubbed away and then fresh pollen falls on top. Think about snow. If you don't live in a place with a lot of pollen, you can imagine footprints, fresh snow can fall on it, but you kind of still see the original disturbance.
So maybe you think this guy is some sort of circus performer and is able to leap tall fences in a single bound. It's not just the fence. There's also the fact that Ward, who is on the same floor as Robert, did not hear an intruder, did not wake up when Robert was attacked, and in fact, the intruder, if they were a random person, bypassed his room to go into the room where Robert was and stab him, apparently after walking around the bed and stabbing him from the right side. There's also the fact that it wasn't just Ward. None of the men in the house heard the intruder walking on what has been described as 100-year-old, very creaky stairs, which Zaborski even admitted that, yeah, we should have heard that. I don't know why we didn't. Remember, they claimed to be awoken by door chimes. Something as simple as that woke them up. Or maybe some muffled sound from the bedroom, but they didn't hear the creaky stairs.
In addition to the creaky stairs, again, those of you who've lived in 100-year-old houses, because of the narrowness of these row houses and how they're all built together because they're row houses, what I remember from all the row houses I've ever been in or lived in DC, which are dozens of them, in addition to it being creaky, it actually kind of shakes the house, especially if you're wearing shoes of substance. So boots, sneakers are okay. Heels definitely make a lot of sound. But when you go down the stairs, it actually it kind of shakes the entire house if you are running with any type of force. And you would think that an intruder is wanting to get out of there. So instead of being lithe and like a gazelle, skipping every step and just bounding out the front door without ever being heard, you would hear kind of the dun 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 as you're running down the stairs. So not only the creaks, but also kind of the reverberations of these old 100-year-old stakes that are holding up the rest of the structure of the house.
Yeah, and Victor, give him credit. Victor Zaborski, when he says, yeah, we should have heard that, and that's the right answer, because you should have. You should have heard it either going up or going down. The door chime should not be the only thing you heard. You should absolutely know there was an intruder in the house by that point, but they apparently didn't. There's also no sign of forced entry, and nothing in the home is stolen, despite the fact that, as we said, there's a lot of really valuable stuff there. And typically, if you break into a house, you're doing it to steal something. Now, in D.C., there are plenty of people who just, either because they're not in their right mind or because they're on drugs, just want to hurt somebody. But once again, if they did that, they bypassed the first person they could have hurt, and they hurt Robert instead. And oh, by the way, they didn't bring their own weapon. So they walked into a house without having any idea who was in there, or even worse, knew there were 3 men who lived there, did not bring a weapon, and used essentially a flimsy steak knife as their weapon, bypassing other larger knives, by the way. And that's what they decided to do, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. The room that Robert was sleeping in was orderly. Nothing was out of place. There was no sign of struggle. His wallet wasn't stolen. His phone wasn't stolen. It was as if someone, an assassin, came in just to murder him. And obviously no one else in the home was attacked. Now look, that happens sometimes. It's not the case that everybody in the house is murdered. We talked about this in Idaho. But in this case, one person was killed, and then the person who killed them immediately fled, if you believe it's an intruder.
And I think it's worth noting, especially how Robert was found, is we have talked about horrific stabbing crime scenes where someone was trying to run away and, you see blood trails of them running away and they end up in their bedroom or they end up kind of flung on the bed. Robert, if you did not see the stab wounds, looked as if he were asleep. So he were perfectly lined. There was, the sheets weren't ruffled. He wasn't halfway off the bed. Sometimes, my arm falls off the bed if I'm completely dead asleep, it kind of goes to the side of the bed. He was perfectly laid, as if picture perfect, as if he were asleep. No sign that there had been any struggle before, during, or after. And essentially, if you had not known better, you would have just thought he were sleeping. That is a strange scene and eerie in and of itself.
Now, I think one thing a lot of you out there are thinking, if you've seen the documentary, you probably remember that the defense claimed that there was a crushed cover on a sandbox next door that indicated to them there was an intruder, that person had either stood on that and leapt over. I guess they would have had to have done that because they left through the front door. So they stood on the box and leapt over the fence, and they left the crushed box cover behind. But as the court pointed out, if an intruder had gone from that point over the fence, they would not have landed in the backyard. They would have fallen into the steep brick stairwell leading down to the basement. So a lot of you guys are familiar with this. You've got sort of an outdoor stairwell that leads to your basement, and you can just imagine they're essentially leaping over into a hole because it goes straight down. And if you did that, you wouldn't be then breaking into somebody's house. You would have been breaking all your bones. So while the defense presented this as sort of an alternative theory, when you actually look at the layout of the house and where you would have landed, if you went over the fence at that point, that's not what this person did. They did not leap from that point where the sandbox was over the fence. And that takes away a huge piece of evidence that the defense wanted to point to say this was an intruder. And for what it's worth, when the court concluded reviewing all this evidence, they not only found that the intruder theory was not plausible, they found it, or she found it, quote, incredible beyond a reasonable doubt.
Those are some pretty strong words. Okay, so really there are 2 theories in this case. The second theory has many sub almost infinite potentials. But there's 2 theories. An intruder did it, or one of the 3 men, or all of the 3 men did it. So we've covered the intruder theory. Really, we covered it in the negative, all the problems with it, because there are a lot of problems with it. And we're not the only ones to think that. I think this judge, who wrote a very extensive opinion and heard all of the testimony, reached the conclusion that we have been kind of seeing that the evidence bears in this case, which is that it's incredible beyond a reasonable doubt. So that leaves not an intruder, but someone in the house did it. There are a few ways to look at this. Investigators theorize that Joe, Victor, and Dylan, or at least one of them, murdered Robert. We know this. This was the prosecution's theory. Their theory is based upon the fact that there's no evidence suggesting an intruder entered the home. Now, when you rule out something, then you have to look at what's left. And there are 3 men in the house. But what's the motive? The investigators theorized that the motive was sexual. Now, there was some evidence to suggest that Robert was sexually assaulted This is in the affidavit. And a large collection of BDSM items, including things that could restrain a person, were found in this home. Specifically, it was found in Dylan's closet. They also cite the fact that there was very little blood, indicating that Robert's body may have been cleaned, or there was some effort of cleaning up the blood before the police showed up. They also noted that there was strange behavior among the three men when the EMTs and police arrived at their house after they had called to say that their friend had been stabbed. Investigators also noted that the bloody knife on the nightstand looked likely staged, and they note that there was a missing knife from the cutlery set found in Dylan's room. And they also note that that missing knife, even though they don't have it to test with, but they have the cutout of the knife, the size of the blade, the angles, would have fit the injuries much better than the knife that was next to the bed where Robert lay.
And, typically it's not that all three of them did it. That's really not the theory. I mean, nobody can say for sure, right? But I think the theory is not... I guess one theory is that all three of them did it together. That for some reason, they decided they were going to do this. Like we said, there are three stab wounds, 3 people, 1 stab wound apiece, and then what you did last summer or whatever. And that happens. There are certainly cases where each person has to take a stab so that they're all in it together. That absolutely happens. I'm not saying it doesn't. But I think typically the theory is more that probably one of them did it and the rest covered it up. I think the theory goes that the scream that you heard, or that was heard by neighbors, wasn't Robert. It was one of these men finding this happen. And I think most people think it was Victor. I think Victor is always seen as the person who is least likely to have been directly involved in this. Remember, Dylan's on the second floor. Dylan is presented in the documentary and in a lot of places is sort of the one who's kind of the outsider, the sort of, the stranger one, and maybe he would do something. The knife is missing from underneath his bed. He had easier access. You would think Victor would know if it was Joe Price. If it was Joe Price who was doing this, you would think he would know. So it seems like the most popular theory, I think, is that Ward did it. Ward did it for some reason. Unclear exactly why. Might have had a sexual motive. Either Joe Price may have been involved or he walked in on it at some point. Victor Zaborski walks in on it as well, and they decide they're going to cover this up. They enter into a pact of silence. And that pact has been unbroken to this point. And we've talked about some of the reasons people think that. The way they acted afterwards, the sort of veil of silence that fell over them, the way Joe Price looked at Ward when he started to talk. It just feels like they had constructed sort of a hasty cover story for whatever happened. The sexual assault thing, it's open for debate. The evidence of sexual assault was not allowed in at trial. I think the judge had precluded it. It's interesting because she precluded it before it was clear that she was going to be the one making the decision in a bench trial. But she essentially said whether or not he was sexually assaulted is too prejudicial and not probative enough of whether or not the three of them after the murder covered it up. The evidence of sexual assault, we talked about this before, the presence of semen both on his body and inside of his body, indicating some sort of sexual assault. It's just hard to imagine how the semen would have gotten where it was. Some people in the defense pointed to maybe this is something that happens to the body after you die. There are false positives for this. Sometimes you will see cases where sexual assault is suggested, where later on it's proven it didn't happen. There's a couple problems with that, though. Number one, that's usually when you have a body that isn't found for some time. It's sort of a natural part of the decomposition of the body is the production of certain fluids, which can be mistaken for semen. The other problem is it's not just inside his body. It's not just in the anal cavity. It's also on his body. So how you could account for that is a little harder to say. That part of the case, it's probably been the least examined because it was not a part of the trial, so it's kind of hard to say. And
we have no kind of battle of the experts, for example.
Right, exactly.
And this is why we say, we know this exists in the file, but you have to look at this type of evidence with different weight than what was tested under oath, under cross-examination, because there was just no opportunity to test that evidence with battle of the experts. One expert may be able to say there's secretion even within hours or even within minutes, I don't know, of a death, or that there's different possibilities of how sexual assault didn't happen, or something isn't consistent with sexual assault. We don't know those sorts of things because there was just a rape kit done. And that is just meant to have an answer medically, right? Like, we don't know what's going on. We're just trying to have an answer. That is not meant to definitively say whether a rape had happened, for example. Whether a rape happened is actually there's a legal definition, and that wasn't at issue in this case. And we say this to you because we know this to be in the file, but we have to weigh it differently and recognize what we don't know about it, that it may have been disproved in some way if there had been experts who could have testified either in favor or against it.
And I'll say this, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, just because I think you can really get sucked down the rabbit hole on that. And I'm not saying it's not important, and I'm not saying that it couldn't really inform your theory if you knew for certain. But the fact that we can't know for certain, I think it's better to try and deal with what you have and what seems pretty certain than in this area, which is very murky and I think a little sensational and probably more likely to lead you down the wrong path than to get you to the right path. So those are the possible theories out there. Now, one thing that's interesting is we've already told you, the court has said it wasn't an intruder. Beyond a reasonable doubt, it wasn't an intruder. And if it wasn't an intruder, that means one of these guys did it. And if you read the opinion, it seems like one of them did it, or three of them did it. But what we know for sure is that three of them covered it up. And yet, at the conclusion of the trial, the court found them not guilty. Why is that? And this is probably what will take up the rest of our episode, and we'll do our theories and a little cleanup in the next episode. But why is it that you had this trial, you have this opinion, which if you read it is just damning to everybody in this case? Just all three of these men get hammered by this judge. And yet at the conclusion, she finds them not guilty. Why is that? Well, here is what she said in her opinion. And this is, like I said, the great thing about having a judge and not a jury is when you have a jury, when it's over, you get a couple jurors who will go onto the media and talk about what they were thinking. But honestly, I give that so little weight. I give that because it's just one person. Who knows if what they're saying really reflects what happened? Who knows if it reflects what everybody was thinking? They always feel pressure to say one thing or another. 10 years later, half of them are going to say, well, if I had to do it again, I would have quit. You always see that in these cases, and people always point to that in these innocence cases. Even the jury says now they wouldn't convict. But what's great about this is the judge has to write all this down before she releases her opinion, and so you have her thoughts in the moment about why she found them not guilty. And you should read the whole thing. It's worth reading. It's a fascinating, well-written opinion. You'll learn a lot. You'll learn a lot about this case. You'll learn a lot about the law. But this paragraph, I think, sums it up.
And before you read that, what's so interesting about this very thoughtfully written opinion is it's clear the judge paid attention the whole time, right? We've talked about this where you can have a long trial and you're at points in the trial, you're like, I don't know if this judge is listening whatsoever. This judge gets it. This judge listened to all the evidence, retained the evidence, analyzed the evidence, which frankly is why her ultimate conclusion is so confusing.
Yes. Well, here's her attempt to make it make sense, and then we'll give our opinions on it. Here's what she says. Any one of the defendants could have been the odd man out of the scheme. Any one of them could have believed the others when he was told that they were not responsible for Mr. Wone's death and that they had no idea how it had occurred. Any one of them could have found the intruder theory plausible in the face of these denials if he did not know the real truth and if he trusted his co-defendants at the time. If any defendant was this one, his statements were not knowingly false, and his statements were not made with the intent to keep the police from solving the murder. I do not find beyond a reasonable doubt that the statements of any defendant were so knowingly or demonstrably false that they alone could establish this charge. So that is sort of a one-paragraph explanation of this. I will just say, I understand where the judge is coming from. It's hard for me to say that I think the judge is wrong, but I do think she's wrong in that it's almost like she considered all three of them as a whole. And they were either all three innocent, or they were all three not guilty. You couldn't prove it, or they were all three guilty. And I don't think that's right at all. I think based on the evidence, Victor, maybe. I mean, honestly, when you look at the evidence and you look at how she describes the evidence, it is almost impossible to believe that all three of these men were not in on this cover-up from the moment they made that, maybe not the 911 call, but from the moment the police arrived, they were all in on this. It's just so hard to imagine how this could have gone down and that they didn't all know. But just for a second, maybe Victor, I don't know if it's reasonable doubt, but maybe Victor was in the dark here. Though, honestly, I don't even think that's true because once again, it's hard to imagine how any of them could have known. In my mind, Dylan Ward is absolutely guilty. If it wasn't an intruder beyond a reasonable doubt, then Dylan Ward was involved in this crime, period. Either covering it up or committing it. And if he committed it, he's guilty of obstruction. And if he covered it up, he's guilty of obstruction. He's absolutely guilty. I think Joe Price is right there with him in the absolutely guilty count. If she wanted to say, I just can't say that Victor knew, okay. But this idea that any one of them could have not been involved, I just don't buy that. I don't buy it at all. It's just, and the other thing, if Victor was involved, then Joe had to have been involved, right? Like, how is Joe not involved in this either way? Like, I don't know.
So I read it slightly different. I think she got it wrong. But I think what she was doing is, rather than seeing them all as a whole, I think she saw exactly what you and I see, which is that Victor is the weak link here. But she gave the benefit. She talked about Victor. I think every time she talks like that, she's actually talking about Victor, but she doesn't know how to actually parse through Victor. I think she was able to, by the way, and I'll say how I think she was able to carve out Victor and she didn't. I think she knew she didn't have everything there for Victor, but she didn't know how to parse the defendant separately to be able to give him the lightest judgment, whereas the others would get heavier ones. Here's why I think it's completely clear that Victor obstructed justice. He said, I don't know when he became all the way into the know. You don't have to be told the plan, by the way. This is not a conspiracy. This is obstruction of justice. So he did not have to have meeting of the minds. I think it's very possible Victor did not know exactly what went down. I think he was kept in the dark to some degree, and he may still actually be in the dark as to the complete picture of what happened. But at some point, he was a little bit less in the dark. When he was still in the dark is when I think he said the very telling note. He said, yeah, we should have heard an intruder going down the creaky steps. Those are not his exact words, but he said that when he was a little bit caught off guard. He wasn't in the midst of being coached as he was the rest of the call. And he kind of made a blunder. And I think at that moment, if he was in the dark, he's a smart man. These are all smart men. These are smart men who had well-paying jobs, who were all professionals in their fields. Something went off in his head and he goes, dang it, we should have heard it. We didn't hear it. They intentionally kept him in the dark. So from that moment, when he said that, to the next part, which is there was an intruder, and for all his other interrogations where he insisted that nothing was awry with that theory, that's where obstruction was clearly found because of his previous comment, and then what comes after it, because the judge was like, it is incredible beyond a reasonable doubt. And the fact that he, Victor, has never been able to explain why that is, that in his own words, you should have heard someone in our house and I did not hear it. He's never been able to explain it. He never tries to explain it. He just about faces and then falls into line. I truthfully think Victor doesn't know the full story. He knows enough because he's a smart man and he may have seen enough to put the pieces together. So I think there is a world where he doesn't have the full picture. You don't have to have the full picture, guys. You don't have to have meeting of the minds. He doesn't have to know what's going on. This is not a conspiracy. This is obstruction of justice. And I think he obstructed justice when he did not answer truthfully about the plausibility of an intruder. Even if he doesn't know exactly who did it, he does not believe there was an intruder based on the facts that he does know in that house. And more likely, actually, I think he knows a lot more. I'm trying to give him the best benefit of the doubt to give the judge's opinion the best reading. So I think even with what the judge had, and even with her doubts about the culpability of Victor, he clearly obstructed justice.
Guys, I want to talk about one of our new favorite sponsors, Penrose First Leaf. If you're a wine lover like me, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. We have found the most awesome personalized wine club. It has amazing wines and exclusive perks. I'm talking about First Leaf. Now, you guys know me. Big fan of bourbon. Wine, I don't really know anything about it. I've always liked wine, but didn't really know what I was looking for. Didn't really know what I was going to like. Well, that's where First Leaf comes in. They get to know you. You can answer a few quick questions on their website about what flavors you like, what styles you like, and how adventurous do you want to be. I went full adventurous, and I ended up getting wines from around the world. I loved First Leaf so much that I signed up. I am a member, and I'm getting wine shipments with a personalized collection of wines that I love. And my wife and I enjoy so much opening them up and trying new styles from new places that we never would be able to enjoy were it not for First Leaf.
And it's so easy. First, you just answer a few quick questions on their website about what flavors you like, how often you drink, whether you prefer red, white, rosé. And based on these answers, First Leaf curates an amazing selection of wines just for you. And then once I drink those wines, I rate them and they get to know my wine selection even better. And best of all, I get to choose when I want my box delivered and how often I get new assortments of wine. Being part of the First Leaf Wine Club also has its perks. As a member, we get access to their incredibly helpful wine concierge. So if I want wine pairing advice or to talk about the wines in my box, I can always speak to one of their experts. Plus, we get member exclusive pricing on every order. Join the club today and discover new wines you'll love with First Leaf. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/prosecute to get your first box. That's tryfirstleaf.com/prosecute. Tryfirstleaf.com/prosecute.
And just to be clear, there was a conspiracy charge, but there was also obstruction of justice charge.
Right.
And
that
you
was
could
the
have
easy
found
one
him
for
guilty
Victor, I
that.
think.
But I feel like in her mind, she only thought of it through the lens of conspiracy. But here's the thing. Just try and imagine for yourself the scenario that could have happened in that house in that very short period of time where one of them murders Robert and they all three don't know it by the time the police arrive. I mean, remember the creaky stairs and everything else. I mean, somebody had to go down those stairs and get that knife. That had to happen at some point. Somebody walked down those creaky steps and got that knife. Somebody screamed. There had to be some, imagine if Joe, just in your mind, assume that she's saying, look, two of them clearly did this, but one of them didn't. Presumably, I don't think anybody's arguing that two of them decided to kill Robert. Maybe they did. But the conversation, the discussion that would have happened if one of them found the other one murdering somebody, or if one of them found the other two murdering somebody. How is it possible that all three of these people would not have been perfectly aware? There would have been movement. All that movement we've been talking about, the sound, it would have been happening as people were sort of freaking out about what exactly to do. How are we going to do this? Just the idea that two of them could have been involved in covering this up, and the third one blissfully unaware, just doesn't make sense. But that's what she says. I mean, she's saying any one of them could have been the odd man out. No, that's not possible. I don't think one of them could have been.
Especially when you look at their relationship, right? Joe and Victor, by their testimony, were in bed together that night, right? And then we have, in order to walk past the dead body to get to the third man who's alive in that house. So we are not talking about some roommate situation like in Idaho, where roommates live on different floors and are kind of living together by happenstance rather than because they are in a relationship with each other, right? This is not that situation where you have people who are just passing each other in the night. In fact, there was someone living, a tenant, in their basement. So in DC, it's very common to rent out your basement. You usually have a separate entrance. That's usually code so that there's no entryway from inside the house. We rented a basement apartment, right? It's just a way to help make the mortgage. And there was someone in there that night who testified at trial. And that person is in a very different situation because she essentially is in a whole different house, right? There was no entryway into the main house. And by the way, if you've ever lived in a basement apartment of a 100-year-old house, you certainly hear when people walk above you all the time, right? She didn't testify to that. So again, you have to look at the situation of these three men. These are not some random people who answered Craigslist ads to help make rent meet in one of the most expensive parts of DC. These are people with relationships. These are people, when they were put together in a living room before questioned for the first time, were whispering among themselves, where one spoke for all three of them. Note that. Joe spoke for all three of them. And when one started to speak out of line, Dylan, he looked over to stop. To somehow say that there's an odd man out or they all three didn't have some knowledge more than they let on to investigators, so that may or may not be the break in this case. I think it's the absolute break. It's the only break we'll ever get in this case. Is trying to slice that bread just too thin. There's no slice, man. You're seeing right through the bread. And I think the judge was trying to slice and dice it, and I don't think there's anything there to slice and dice.
Well, what's unfortunate is I think the judge did the thing that we talk about sometimes that we worry that juries will do, which is the thing you hear people in true crime say all the time. Well, I know he did it, but I don't know if I could convict. I don't know if I know beyond a reasonable doubt.
And she said that.
And she said it.
She literally says, you can have feelings. I'm paraphrasing her. One can know. One is her herself, by the way.
Certainty.
One may know what really happened, but one may not have the evidence to back up that. She literally is saying what the jurors say all the time on TV. I know he did it, but I couldn't convict. I don't know if he really did. I didn't see him do it. I didn't have firsthand knowledge. I didn't see the knife go in and out and in and out and in and out. That's essentially what she's saying. Look, I respect her because being a judge, I am not a judge. It is a hard job, and this is a hard case. And you have 3 men who have been accused of something just shy of murder. This was a murder trial without it being a murder trial, and these were 3 well-respected men in the community. I get it. This is hard. So I'm not trying to be super hard on this judge because you know what? I've never been in that position, and I did not write this opinion, and it is a good opinion. She's clearly a good judge. But I think she does what I do a lot. She overthought it. And all the words in her opinion pointed one way. This happens in Supreme Court opinions sometimes, by the way. Justice Robert does this all the time. All of her sentences all point in the direction of guilty. And then last minute, literally like in the last paragraph, she does an about-face skirt, and she like veers off onto unknown terrain, despite every sentence in a 30-page opinion supporting a finding of obstruction of justice at the very least.
And I think a jury would have convicted him, not because a jury is, more easily swayed by emotion or anything like that. I just think I think it probably weighed on her. It's all on her. She's going to make the decision all by herself. And I think this felt like this was an incredibly unusual case. You don't see cases like this very often. She would have had to have stepped out, and she would have known that because she's a judge. A jury, just looking at this in isolation, it's the only case there'll probably ever be a jury on, just weighing the evidence. I think they would have found them all guilty. And it wouldn't have been as hard for them because it wouldn't have been on one of them. They all would have come to the conclusion together. They would have talked about this. They would have used their common sense, and they would have found them guilty. I think it was really smart for the defense to pick a judge. And it worked out for them.
And to do it all together. By the way, you have the opportunity when you're a defendant to be tried separate from your co-defendants. And oftentimes that works better, right? Especially if you're an innocent guy or you're low man on the totem pole. Imagine like a big Ponzi scheme. If you're low man on the totem pole and you're not that top rainmaker, you don't want to be tried with him because he's probably done a whole lot more bad things than you did. You probably were like a runner, doing illegal things, but like on a small scale. You're just like bringing bags of money from point A to point B where he's like having people killed and, stealing massive amounts of international funds. You don't want to be tried in the same set of facts as that guy. And so you can sever from your co-defendants. Here, very smart not to sever because then you have that problem, which the judge kind of gets into, which is like, I don't really know who's who.
Yeah, when everybody points at each other and says the other guy did it, it can be kind of difficult. It's a pretty smart strategy. So that's how this case ended. There's a couple things to note. Number one, these men could still be charged with murder. The reason for that is because murder and obstruction are 2 separate criminal acts that involve 2 separate factual patterns. The murder is over when the obstruction begins. So it would not be double jeopardy to charge them with murder because the murder is a separate act. You couldn't charge someone with murder, lose the case, and then charge them with manslaughter. You can't do that. Same common nucleus of facts, same crime. You can't do that. But the obstruction
lying to
charge,
the police is different than being the one to stab him, for example.
Exactly. Obstruction happens afterwards. It's an entirely separate factual pattern. It doesn't really matter who killed him. It doesn't really matter how he died. That's one of the reasons the sexual assault stuff was kept out. So that will not stop them from being charged with murder in the future. But in order for that to happen, you're going to have additional evidence because although I think the judge is absolutely wrong when it comes to obstruction, she's right when it comes to murder. You can have strong feelings about who did it. We're going to get into our theories next time, and we'll probably give you those feelings about who we think did it. But it's hard to say for sure. It's hard to be certain about who did it. I feel certain beyond a reasonable doubt that all 3 of these men were involved in this cover-up.
And it's hard to show conspiracy to commit murder, too, because of that same problem.
Right. But, and look, there's no statute of limitations on murder. we can all hope that increased focus on this case will lead to more evidence and maybe they'll be charged in the future. But so that...
And that's a great point here, right? I'm glad that there was a documentary. I'm glad that we're covering this. I hope a lot of other people cover it. I hope a lot of people go watch the documentary because, the worst thing about cases that have been cold for a while is that witnesses die, witnesses' memories fade. I think the witnesses relevant here, their memories haven't faded. And so it's just a matter of time before some information. There is information out there. Like we talked about that puzzle piece with missing pieces. This particular case has some big holes, big puzzle pieces missing. But they're not lost. They're just missing.
I would say there are 3 people who know exactly what happened that night. And if any of them ever decide to talk, maybe we can have justice in this case. And I guess the good thing is if one of them talks and their only involvement was obstruction, they've now been acquitted of obstruction, so they can't be charged with anything. So maybe they should remember that when they're thinking about whether or not to clear their conscience. Okay, so we're going to end for now. I'm going to talk about our theories next time. We'll see how long that goes. And based on how long it goes, we'll decide whether that's should be a completely independent episode next week or we should just do it tomorrow for those of you who are listening on the podcast, not for those of you who are listening live. And we'll figure out how that goes, and we'll do the appropriate thing. If it turns out it's 30 minutes long, not that we've ever been able to talk 30 minutes about anything.
I was going to say, come on. You said we would tie up today. Yeah. I was like, oh, please.
I know. I was wrong. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes and let you guys know when that happens. But, Alice, do you have time for questions?
Absolutely.
This has been a great case. I've really enjoyed discussing this one with you, Alice. I hope people have enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed covering it, because it is a wild one.
It's a head scratcher.
It is.
I've never had a case where, as we covered it, my thinking on it didn't get honed. If anything, it's like every day. It's like those, the sand pictures where you can draw little sand things and then you shake it and everything gets wiped away. That's what happens after every episode for me. No clearer picture of what happened.
Okay, so this person has an interesting question. This is from 1911812316, and they want to know, if someone is found incapable of assisting in their own defense, would they just be released or would they be hospitalized? And is it possible for a prison to be held liable for a mental decline? Okay, so
Great
quick,
question.
That's a great question. So you cannot, if you are incompetent to stand trial, so you can't assist in your own defense is one of the aspects of being incompetent, then you can't be tried. But you are not automatically released. There's sort of I'll tell you how it works in the federal system, and this is pretty similar to the way it works in the states. So if you're found incompetent to stand trial, the first thing that happens is you're sent off to see whether or not you can be restored to competency, either through sort of mental counseling or medication or various other methods. If the facility, the doctors there, determine that you cannot be restored to competency, then something called a dangerousness assessment is ordered. And there's a determination about whether or not you're dangerous to the community. If you are found to be dangerous, you can be held indefinitely. So you could have a crime that has a 5-year maximum and be held basically for the rest of your life if you're dangerous. So it's not necessarily a good thing to be found incompetent. Now, if at some point after that dangerousness assessment, if you are no longer dangerous, then you can be released. If you suddenly are restored to competency, you can go back and be tried. The other thing, so let's say you're found not to be dangerous. Well, if you're not dangerous, you can't be held. But the case is not dismissed against you. The government can keep the indictment on top of you, and basically, if at any point you are restored to competency, they can move forward with the trial, and the Speedy Trial Act is not implicated because periods of incompetency are not counted towards your speedy trial deadlines. So that's essentially how that works.
And here's the thing about all of that. Competency is something that actually does come up not infrequently in our cases, but there's a thing called malingering. Malingering is the medical term where you pretend to be incompetent to try and get out. And I see that actually in my not violent crime cases, right? Like people who've committed white collar crimes, fraud, or something like that. And they maybe have watched too much TV and they think if I can act crazy, I'll just be released. And the judge tries to inform them. And if they have a good attorney who informs them where it's like, clear to the rest of us that there's some level of malingering happening, they think that they can just act crazy enough in court that day that the judge will be like, well, nothing to do. You're clearly incompetent. Have a great day, Ms. Smith. That's not what happens. You are in the custody of the government, and you don't get sent to some like posh hospital. It's prison that also has a medical facility to try and restore you and do an independent evaluation. And usually it's several months. And especially if you're not a violent person to begin with, you typically don't have to be held in custody awaiting your trial. You get to live your life at home under certain rules, whether it's electronic monitoring or you check-ins with, a probation officer, but not so if you're deemed incompetent after a hearing by the judge. You're now kind of not free to move around and even more restricted because you probably may be confined to, a hospital bed, for example, if there's a level of dangerousness. That's something that I have seen on more than one occasion where we went through an entire long competency hearing that goes on and on. We get these experts and doctors involved, and we have, different mental evaluations, and we put experts on the stand because we want to get to the truth. And the judge has to make a finding of incompetence. The person will hear, wait, I don't get to leave now? I'm just kidding, judge. That really happened to me one time in court. We had gone through a 3-day competency hearing, and all the experts in the case were like, yeah, the way they answer their questions, they say demons, they say, all these different things, based on what they're telling me, they are not competent to stand trial at this time. And the judge was like, well, based on all of these experts and the government, I'm not going to say anything different than the experts. I am in an interest to have a competent defendant as a prosecutor. And that happened 3-day hearing, so many resources, and the judge made the uncontested ruling that the person was incompetent and said, and now, I remand you to the custody and you will be sent to so-and-so facility for the next 6 months. And this defendant stood up and said, what? I don't just get to go? Clearly very competently. And the judge said, no, I've been trying to explain to you this entire time. And this defendant said, never mind, I'm kidding. I'm good. I promise. I'm good. That was just a joke. I'm good. I mean, so a lot of defendants don't even know that's the case. It is not a get out of jail free card at all.
Yeah, and there's a difference, and we talked about this some when we talked about the Hoggle case. There's a difference between being not guilty by reason of insanity and being incompetent to stand trial. They are two different things. One is about whether or not you could understand what you're doing was wrong when you committed the crime. And the other is about whether or not you can assist in your defense at the time of your trial. Completely different. So, a lot of these people, I think Alice is right. They think if I can convince them I'm incompetent, that means I get to go free. And it's just not. That's just not the way it is. And insanity is a much higher bar than
And insanity
competency.
is not a reason not to go to trial. Insanity is an affirmative defense you have to raise at trial. It doesn't keep you from going to trial, whereas incompetency keeps you from going to trial. So it's a big difference.
Right. Because you can be insane at the time of the crime and competent to go to trial. And you can be sane at the time of the crime and incompetent to go to trial. It's
and you
different.
can be both. You can be insane at the time of the crime and incompetent.
Hey, Nurse Mom wants to know if we've ever put anyone on death row. So Alice and I were federal prosecutors, so we don't have a lot of death penalty
The feds
cases.
have a death penalty, but almost never use it. I think you have to get approvals all the way to the top. I mean, when was the last? Was it the Boston bombers? Was the last death penalty case?
I think that's right.
The Boston Marathon bombers were the last ones. So it is not something commonly used in the federal system whatsoever.
Yeah. I mean, so I've talked about this some before. When I was in the Solicitor General's office, I handled death penalty cases and often handled sort of the final appeals. So I've had one person that I handled their case executed, 2 who are still on death row, one of whom probably is pretty close to the end because the case I handled was their last real appeal. So at some point, they'll probably be executed. And then I had one who, as our capital unit director used to say, his final appeal was denied, which meant he died in prison. So he would have been executed, but he died in prison. And that happens a lot because so many of these death penalty cases drag on for years, and it'll be 20, 30 years after the murder. The person who was executed, their crime was in 1996 or 97, and I think they were executed in 2019, maybe. And then the guy who died, his was in the 80s. He'd been on death row for forever. So you see that, yeah, that often happens. Okay, one last question, because that's always depressing to talk about the death penalty. Let's see. I'll ask this question, but I'm gonna bet I don't know what. I don't want to speak for you. Okay, Saints fan in Pittsburgh. Who are each of your celebrity hall passes?
I don't believe in hall passes.
Yeah.
But truthfully, I don't. But I don't know.
I don't know. You know,
I guess
I mean,
I'm not an ogler of the physical body. Like a good mind, or if you're a really good musician, like that is attractive to me. But I'm not like, I don't like watch, I don't watch movies and think like, I don't know. I know a lot of my friends like to watch Magic Mike and be like, oh my gosh, that's my hall pass. I'm like, really? Like, that would be kind of boring, to be totally honest.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really interested in just hooking up with random people. But, there are lots of people that I would love to, like, sit down and
hang out with.
I mean, I'll say this.
Like, have a mental
I don't know
affair?
if it was a mental affair. There you go. I don't know if it was Labyrinth or what, but Jennifer Connelly was I just always thought she was incredibly beautiful, just classically beautiful, amazing actress. Yeah, so I would put her high on the list of people
Rather
I'd
than
like to
hall
have a
pass,
cup of
I'd
coffee
love
with.
to actually be friends with some of these people, right?
Well, Joe just mentioned Lana Del Rey. I would love to be friends with Lana Del Rey. I'm so
But you want to be friends with her.
fascinated.
You don't want to like hook up one time and then never see her again, because
I want to go
what
to
would be
Waffle
more
House
fun
with
is
her
to hang out
and eat a
all the time.
waffle and talk about all of her
songs.
albums. That's what I want to
exactly.
do. I'm much
that
more
would be
interested in
way
that.
more fun than a one-time thing you never get to see them again.
Yeah. So
That's really funny. Thanks for that question. That was a good one.
yeah, good question. Okay, well, I think that's enough for tonight. We'll be back sometime in the future with our theories and wrap up this case. I know you guys are all interested to hear what we think, but this one is just mind-blowing case. They don't make many like this one, so enjoy it while it lasts. Join us on Patreon if you want these early and ad-free. There are people on Patreon who are watching this a month before this is going to come out, and they're having an opportunity to ask questions as we record it, so hopefully they're having a lot of fun. If you have questions you want to ask now, shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com. That is where to make recommendations. People ask all the time. That is the place to do it. Shoot us an email. Or check us out on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and now TikTok @prosecutorspod. You'll enjoy that. And a lot of those of you who are watching on YouTube, you guys are tiny. We have a tiny but mighty YouTube fan base, and enjoy all your comments on the videos. Well, Alice, do you have any other comments you want to make before we sign off?
Justin, I told you so. I knew we couldn't wrap up today, which we never try to rush what I think is the most important part, theories, and we didn't rush it today. So I am excited to talk to you about this, Brett, and hopefully get to some place of more clarity. And one day I hope to have a real answer.
Me too. All right, guys, we'll be back later. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors.
I always do it to my microphone.
Hello, everyone.
Microphone, do you see my fingers? Oh, you see that? I feel like I had a funny story, but I can't remember it now. What you drinking tonight, Brett?
Oh, just sweet tea.
Is it really sweet tea?
Rowan's Creek, which is amazing. Don't buy it, because you'll drive up the price. And we don't want that to happen. No, you can get it some places. We can't get it down here. So when I go to Kentucky, I always get like six bottles of it, 6 barrels.
Nice.
Of it, even better. But
maybe they mark it up when you arrive. They're like,
Probably.
there's our good customer. Oh, look at that. The price doubled. But
Probably.
you're getting a case, aren't you? We'll give you a discount, 10%.
See what's screaming all month long during Pluto TV's April Ghouls. Watch hauntingly good movies like Evil Dead, 30 Days of Night, and Bram Stoker's Dracula. Or holy water hits like The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Plus, Pluto TV has hundreds of channels with thousands of movies and TV shows available on live and on demand. Download the Pluto TV app on all your favorite devices and start streaming now.